Yeah, so welcome, Professor Smith, and thank you for coming on to the Cycladic Preservation Group today.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, so I think my first question is something I ask everyone. It's what made you get into anthropology? What inspired you?
That's a terrific question. So I was originally really interested in politics. And so I came at it first as as a political scientist and political theorist. But I became increasingly frustrated with how political theory was constructed in the abstract. So questions of what is justice that entirely divorced from the real worlds of justice and injustice within which we work. The questions of like, how do you organize a polity without any connection to real polities that have histories and things and objects that embed them in habits and ways of doing and traditions. And so I came into anthropology then out of my frustration with the abstractness of traditional political thinking. And what I liked about anthropology was it had awareness of the burden of tradition, that the past has a kind of weight that actually makes it so that our choices going forward, our choices of our futures, are never choices that are undertaken in a vacuum. They're choices that arise out of a considerable weight of the past upon us and the things that we think that are constructed out of our cultural understandings. But this particularly targeted me towards archaeology because there was a real awareness in archaeology that this burden of the past, this weight that constrains the field of choices that we have, is actually primarily embedded in the object world that surrounds us and that we are highly dependent upon.
Hmm.
And so I became really interested in the way that the things that surround us create real constraints on the possible futures we can imagine. And so that's what got me into archaeology in particular. And then I ended up after the summer of after my first year in graduate school, landing in the former Soviet Union, just as it had unraveled, and found myself in a distinctly fascinating political and archaeological context. And so that's how I ended up where I am today.
The best of both worlds, I guess.
I guess in a certain way, and
Yeah,
then being in the midst of state collapse is a fascinating research experience, but it's also a terrifying experience
of course,
for those who have to go through it.
of course, of course. And so moving to more current things, what does your work at Cornell involve right now?
So we have two projects that are ongoing simultaneously. One has sort of taken over the other, but the project that I've been mostly invested in over the course of the last 30 years has been the field program that I've been running in Armenia, known as Project Aragots, that's short for the archaeology and geography of ancient Trans-Caucasian societies.
Mhm.
And this has been a project that's looking at the long-term socio-political development of the Southern Caucasus region from the beginning of the Bronze Age all the way through the medieval period. My particular focus has always been on the late Bronze Age, which is an era of increased state formation, where you have the emergence of centralized political entities, and you also have the calcification of radical inequality into like strict social hierarchies. And that becomes a prelude then to later imperialism at the beginning of the Iron Age. So that's been the period that I've been most prominently focused on. But over the course of the last 2 years, since the end of the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War, I've also been involved with a research team called Caucasus Heritage Watch, which I co-direct with my colleagues Lori Kachadorian and Ian Lindsay, and with indispensable help from our colleague Husi Kulian. And we've been looking at the condition of heritage monuments in the situation of the ongoing conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan over the disputed enclave of Nagorno-Karabakh. And that project has had kind of two aspects to it. One is a kind of forward-looking, how do we stop heritage monuments from coming into the crosshairs of active conflict? And there, the primary work that we do is regular satellite monitoring, where we task satellites several times a year to provide up-to-date real-time information upon the conditions of several hundred sites that we prioritize. And we change that list every now and then to make sure we capture as much information as we can. And that's been working on primarily focused on identifying sites that have been unfortunately destroyed, largely in the territory ceded to Azerbaijan as a consequence of the ceasefire. But we also have identified several sites that have been damaged in the course of the last 2 years, and also a number of sites that are under serious threat, in large measure from destruction, threats of destruction, but also threats from development projects that are ongoing. So
So
that's been the sort of forward-looking part of Caucasus Heritage Watch. The backward-looking project is we're embarked on several historical projects to try to assess what happened between the first Nagorno-Karabakh war that ended with a ceasefire in May 1994, and the second Nagorno-Karabakh war that ended with the ceding of the territories to Azerbaijan in December 2020. And that's been a historical project that's been undertaken for a number of reasons. One is there's an enormous amount of disinformation and misinformation in the public sphere as to what kinds of heritage impacts were suffered during that period, with accusations of mutual destruction going back and forth between the two sides. And so our goal was to provide a solid empirical foundation by using satellite imagery to provide a full assessment of the structural conditions of these monuments. And so we released a report in October of last year, of 2022, that detailed the complete erasure of Armenian cultural heritage monuments in the Azerbaijani province of Nakhchivan. Out of the 110 sites in our database, 108 were completely obliterated. And the satellite imagery shows that it's not just a matter of negligence or a wall falling down, the kinds of things you expect from old buildings. This was a clear case of targeted destruction, of complete erasure, where the earth, not only was a building razed, but the earth around it was scoured, or the cemetery was completely erased, bulldozed out of existence, often on a couple of occasions then with monuments then built on top of them. So that was the first of our backward-looking reports. And then we're now in the process of doing our second historical report, looking at the condition of Azerbaijani heritage between the wars, when it was under de facto Armenian administration. And so that's the project we're currently finishing up and hope to release in the next few weeks.
I see. So going back to what you said previously, right? In a time of war, how does preservation change, and how does your job change? Because I'm sure it's much different than normal day, right? Preservation.
Yeah. It's a big. First of all, it's a lot more stressful, because there you're talking about not like how do we prevent a wall from falling down, how do we deal with upkeep and maintenance issues, which can be extremely expensive in peacetime conditions. Keeping up heritage is an extremely expensive and labor-intensive proposition, and it oftentimes involves a lot of very hard decisions because resources are not infinite. So some things have to be curated and preserved, and other things just have to be let to be ruins. As an archaeologist, also, I know that ruins are part of the natural landscape as well. So that's in peacetime. But one interesting component of war in the 21st century is that we're finding that much more often attacks on heritage become new forms of waging war by other means. And this is a relatively new phenomenon. It's not new that heritage has been damaged in wartime. That goes back at least to the First World War, if not before, and certainly in the Second World War. There was extensive damage to European heritage sites, oftentimes through Allied bombing in places like Dresden and other places, but also through Nazi atrocities. Particularly Kristallnacht and the attacks on the synagogues in that time. So there was immense cultural heritage damage that came out of World War II. And that produced a number of very important international agreements as the international community began to aspire to seeing heritage as a cause for peace. That heritage could be something that the world could agree on, that we could say, let's take that off the table in cases of military conflict. Let's create an obligation for every state to protect heritage within its territory and also during times of conflict in occupied territories. But in the 21st century, I think we're finding that those international treaties are no longer effective, in large measure because the enforcement mechanisms are almost entirely run by states parties themselves. So it's very difficult to hold a party to the treaty actually responsible for damage. So that's, I'd say, the scary part of where we are with heritage right now, that we're finding that our traditional 20th century mechanisms of enforcement and protection are not up to the task in the 21st century. I think that there is a good, hopeful part of the story, sort of hopeful part of the story. Let's say these stories are all playing themselves out, so you never know which part is hopeful or which part is depressing. But the hopeful part is that there are new global institutions that have begun to take heritage under their remit. So particularly the International Criminal Court, which had the successful prosecution of a Malian citizen in 2015 for damage to World Heritage remains at Timbuktu, which is a remarkable precedent to have an individual held accountable for damage to cultural heritage. And the other is actually emerging from our particular part of the world, where a case at the International Court of Justice, or the World Court, between Armenia and Azerbaijan actually created an obligation in an initial finding, an obligation on Azerbaijan to protect cultural heritage, especially Armenian cultural heritage, under its jurisdiction. Now, how this will play out, we don't know. I will say that in last summer, several months after the ICJ's ruling, Caucasus Heritage Watch did discover a 19th century Armenian church that had been demolished. So it's not clear that the ruling will have the impact that we want it to, but I think it is a hopeful sign that global institutions are realizing the real threat that cultural heritage is under right now, and is eager to take steps to try and push it off the front lines of current conflicts.
And that's great to hear. Maybe, hopefully, a step in the right direction, right?
Let's hope.
Yeah. And then, so moving to a more broad question, right? I think this is something that a lot of people don't really understand, and I had trouble understanding at the beginning. But why is it important to preserve culture? And I know that's sounds like a simplistic question at first, but I think there's a lot behind that, right? So,
Sure. I think there's two answers to that question. One is that cultural heritage provides a repository of memory, which links descendant communities to a past. Now, that past can be configured in multiple different ways, but it's part of what gives a people a kind of sense of personal location, a sense of personal investment in who I am, where I am, and the place that I'm from. So I think that there's a kind of retrospective way in which memory becomes embedded in these objects. And in some ways, it's sort of like what I was talking about earlier. These objects then constrain future possibilities, right? Having created memory and memorialization in form of cultural heritage, we then have real obligations to keep it up. In many ways, it sort of does the work that the idea of homeland used to do, where like, this is the homeland of your people, right? This is the earth from which your people were born. You must protect it. Cultural heritage also serves that kind of rallying point through the distillation of memory. But it also provides a place where identification and identity can be re-inscribed in a daily way. So many of the sites that we look at in the conflicts in the Caucasus are religious sites of religious practice, which become heritage sites because they are sites of profound senses of the metaphysical, but also daily rites that are part of etched into people's everyday lives. And that's part of giving life meaning. And I think it's part of what gives meaning both individually and to collectivities as well. And I think those are some of the reasons why in the 2000s, UNESCO in particular began to think about cultural heritage in much broader terms, to think about not just giant buildings, which are nonetheless critically important, but also the intangible kinds of heritage techniques and practices that give life meaning and give life distinctive meanings to different communities and different descendant groups.
and I'm sure that preservation of the intangible is much different than the tangible, right? And requires a lot of different. I don't know if you can speak on that. Obviously, you're more focused on tangible aspects, but
yeah. So the kind of work we do is really a kind of forensic work. And so it really is focused on material traces,
yeah.
The kind of the ghosts that are left by heritage and conflict. The intangible heritage is much more difficult to do kind of forensic work. That kind of forensic work would happen more in the archive, where you can find programs for, say, settling traditionally nomadic communities, or for eradicating certain forms of musical expression. And those are also often more difficult to preserve, because it's one thing to preserve a building. It's another thing to have the human investment to preserve, say, a form of dance, or a form of singing, or a language. Those things can be much more difficult because you need a kind of corporate body of sufficient depth to be really invested in the reinscription of those forms of practices every day, and the training of a new generation.
Yeah.
And that can be very difficult. And I know there are a number of communities who really struggle.
I have one final question for you. So, whether it be in the US, in Armenia, in Greece, or anywhere, so what would you say that the average person can do to preserve culture?
I think that the first thing I would say is value all culture. I think the first thing that we need to do for the 21st century is to recognize that our individual heritage is only safe if everyone's heritage is safe. The minute that another community's heritage comes under assault, it creates legitimacy for attacks on heritage sites. And therefore, it really is going to take a global effort. We all have to value each other's, and that understanding that your heritage is important as mine, my enemy's heritage is just as important as mine, and that it needs to be taken off the table in conflicts. I think that's the first step. I think the second step is recognizing that the preservation of heritage is just one plank in a larger program of social justice. So that in cases of repression of minorities or authoritarian dictatorships, you are much more likely to get heritage erasure and destruction in those kind of cases. So heritage preservation is not just a problem of management, it's actually a problem of political activism. And the more we can be committed to the cause of freedom and of social justice, the more likely the fragile heritage landscape will survive another century.
Well, that's a great message to end with, and that's just a great message all around. So thank you so much, and it's been great to talk to you. Thank you.
My pleasure. Take care, Nicholas.
Thank you.